grew up in one of the last feudal towns of England. Very successful family. They're all fighters. Ironically, my mum comes from a Catholic family, my dad from a Protestant. So my mum is now Vice-Chancellor of Durham, so to make sure I don't offend any Cambridge students listening to the podcast. One of the primary political instincts I have, I think, comes from my dad, which is anti-extremism. Hard question. I'm always slightly haunted by this, but this is nowhere near as difficult as it would have been 30 or 40 years ago, where it would have been life-alteringly difficult, as what is currently faced by transgender people. There's still these stereotypes about it being really promiscuous, but I was aware from when I was about 10 or 11 that I just never had any crush on any girls. And I gave a rather dramatic speech. All a bit of a blur. Unfortunately, the Twitter views were closer to 800,000. I can only describe it as utterly surreal. I still haven't got my head around it, but I also got some very interesting comments about how I was Boris Johnson's secret love child. Well, it's funny, maybe slightly horrifying. I grew up with a story of British political chaos unfolding from when I was first politically aware. People who are running for the Cambridge Union, it would be horrific training for politics, to be honest, horrific. But I've seen a lot of people who've been really severely bruised. What is people taking something way too seriously?
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. The weather here in Cambridge is just magnificent, and in just a few days I will have my final undergraduate exams ever. Thanks to my friends, family and the community, both here and abroad, I am thoroughly loving Easter exam term this year. Despite these being finals, which are worth 100% of my grades for all 3 years of my tripods subject, I am feeling really blessed to have developed a newfound appreciation for learning. My final exam on Monday will be the paper War and Revolution. Fittingly then, after being asked, I am excitedly taking up this challenge now to do a special Cambridge Union election series. I am a former standing committee member or officer and president candidate of the Cambridge Union, which is founded in 1815 and is the world's oldest debating and free speech society. If you are a follower of my social media or the podcast, you may have already listened to my interviews with other union guests, and in particular last month with the two current candidates for president of the Cambridge Union, Nick Davis and Ellie Breeze. Following those coffee conversations, I greatly appreciate the other candidates also for reaching out. I am admittedly exhausted, to say the least, after handing out water and sandwiches outside refs this morning till 2 a.m. And I would, still like to do some more revision for my final exams, and have also done 2 podcast episodes already, back to back to back. But essentially, I've decided to go back to back to back today for the 3 potential debates officers. There has consequently not been as much research on these guests as I would usually do, but I am, simultaneously also excited to be led by curiosity and spontaneity, and by the guests themselves, because it is their story. This election series is not at all sponsored, and there are no formal partnerships. In fact, as always, I am paying for the coffee out of my own savings, and my aspiration for this Passion Project podcast is, as always, to strive to give my guests legacy-worthy interviews. For this election series, for these back-to-back-to-back interviews today, I sincerely hope that beyond the intense public scrutiny these guests may be facing campaigning, we can all appreciate who they are as human beings, where they have been, are now, and wish to go. This episode is part 3 of 3 for this Union election series. Thank you for tuning in so far. Anyway, just before I introduce the guests, just the usual podcast information. I just feel very blessed that we are now in a position to approach 100,000 podcast downloads, which is just makes me feel very grateful. Please know that I don't take any of your time, feedback and support for granted, because when I started this Passion Project podcast at a low point of my time in Cambridge, I was genuinely motivated by 3 founding ideals. Number 1, purpose of giving. Number 2, learning from others. And number 3, sharing of stories. These 3 aspirations still make up the content description for every single episode. Indeed, the opportunities to strive to give my courageous and insightful guests legacy-worthy interviews over coffee, tea, bubble tea, or water, or chocolates today, despite my many inadequacies, have been a tremendous privilege that imbues me with gratitude. I know that I will listen back and look back to laugh at how naive I am, but if you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, thank you. And please do consider leaving a review and nominating a guest by contacting me via my Linktree, David Quan. Seeing this podcast on people's Spotify Wraps or receiving positive messages about the guests give me tremendous fulfillment. I cannot thank my wonderful guests enough for their courage and insights. I genuinely maintain the deep conviction that this passion project, if wholly true to those founding motivations about giving, learning, and sharing, is a worthwhile pursuit. Finally, thank you for your patience, and we're now on to our really interesting, intellectual, fascinating, and thoughtful guest today. Sammy McDonald is a first-year history student currently studying at St John's College, University of Cambridge. Sammy was born in rural Oxfordshire and has been a lifelong history, politics, and international relations fan. He is most well known around Cambridge for giving a speech in the Union on energy nationalisation that went viral in October. He's also debates officer for CUUNA, which is the Cambridge University United Nations Association, and has spent many years both within the Competitive Debating and Model UN World MUN. He has a particular interest in 19th century history, as well as copious and undiscerning consumption of coffee and hot chocolate around Cambridge. He is also a passionate LGBTQ+ advocate, Nintendo fan, as well as a dog and cat fan. Sammy, fascinating bio. I appreciate your time here in Easter exam term. Welcome to my podcast, Coffees on Me, David Con.
Oh, it's nice to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me. I'll see if I can live up to that extremely generous introduction, but thank you very much for having me on.
Have you had a nice day?
Yes, it's been glorious weather here. I'm mainly celebrating finishing coursework at the moment. Meant to see Michelle Barnier, which was very nice, but very good day overall. It's nice to be in Cambridge when it's not totally freezing and you don't need 4 layers to go to Sainsbury's. That's always glorious. But yes, having a great day.
How's the hay fever?
You can probably hear in my nose, not fantastic, but it is one. I guess the way you can conceptualise it, every cloud has a silver lining. It means we were surrounded by an area of lovely countryside, and it's very nice being around the Johns backs. But every silver lining also has a cloud, unfortunately, and that cloud for me is a pollen allergy. But that's the way I like to conceptualise it. It's very lovely around here. So yeah, apologies if I sneeze.
No. It is very lovely around here. Although you have. I believe you grew up in Oxford, which is similar but different to here.
Yes, so I grew up in a town which is about 8 miles, I think, northwest of Oxford, called Woodstock, which was a 13th century town, but was mainly built up around the 18th century, so extremely rural. It's in the vicinity of population about 2,000 or 3,000. It's the vicinity of this sort of. I always like to joke I grew up in one of the last feudal towns of England, because half the employment and the vast majority of the land is controlled by this duke in Blenheim Palace. It's absolutely gorgeously beautiful. I would encourage anyone to visit it, but it's obviously a slightly different change of pace from the sort of London city life that most of my friends are used to. Great sense of community. I do miss the place. It's very, very nice. Absolutely gorgeous. But as you can imagine, from a hay fever point of view, probably not ideal. But absolutely gorgeous. I do miss it when I'm not there.
Had you been in that same house your whole childhood?
Yes, I had. I remember when I was a child, we were going to move, and I was an opinionated child, and I objected very strongly. But no, don't worry, that was not the reason the move was cancelled. I wasn't that awful to my parents. But yes, we've been in the same house since I was born. My parents have lived they used to in fact live in Cambridge, but they've also lived in Bath, and they moved to Woodstock, I believe, just before my sister was born in 1999. So, and they've been in the same house since.
Amazing. So you come from as far as I understand, a family of academics. So do you want to maybe give some context of the intellectual environment that you grew up in at home?
Yes, this is going to sound, it is slightly intense. So both my father and my mother are academics of English literature, albeit from extremely different backgrounds. So my father was born in the 60s in Northern Ireland, so he witnessed as a child the height of the sectarian conflict going on there. Neither of his parents come from a very academic background at all. His mother worked for the Housing Association, which was one of the few functioning institutions desegregating Northern Ireland at the time. he remembers his family was itself victim of sectarian violence. They're a Protestant family, but they were seen as not, I think in 1972, I think this was relating to the Sunningdale strike, they were seen as not sufficiently loyal. They were forced to move, and that's a fairly foundational, because of violent threat, which is a fairly foundational environment in my dad's life. But he managed to, because of his grammar school, Methody, he's exceptionally bright. He got into Oxford, got one of the top firsts I believe ever recorded there. I'm extraordinarily proud of him, despite coming from what's an extraordinarily difficult background. He met my mum when I think she was 18, he was 21, and they've been married ever since. And my mum comes from, I love my mum's family very dearly. It's quite different. So my mum's father, he's still alive. He's my granddad and is extremely dear to me. Slightly crazy, but extremely dear to me. He's been a lifelong history academic. So he's a historian mainly of the 18th century, but also of the history of the tradition of finances. He had a background he's since softened his politics, background in very, very left-wing politics indeed. My mum grew up in an extremely political, extremely sort of intellectual environment. Her brother is actually a chemistry professor, and her sister is she's executive in an advertising company. So very successful family. As you can imagine, the conversations are quite lively. They're all fighters. They're all sort of extremely lively, intellectual, engaged people. But yeah, very different backgrounds, very different worlds. It's an interesting contrast. It's also, ironically, my mum comes from a Catholic family, my dad from a Protestant, so that didn't please some of my dad's relatives, as you might imagine.
Where is mum now?
So, my mum is now Vice-Chancellor of Durham, so if anyone's watching who is a Durham student, whatever the misconceptions you've heard about my mother, I'm sure they're not true. But we're all extremely proud of her. She took up that position in, I think, January 2021. But 2022 actually, but she had a background she was an English academic focusing on the Enlightenment, but also specifically feminist participation within the Enlightenment. So she's a big expert on Jane Austen and Mary Wollstonecraft, but also on Gibbon. So has that intellectual background. She then began to have a more student-facing role, so she worked at King's for many years. She then worked at Oxford. She was in charge of managing Oxford's response in terms of the COVID pandemic. I remember sort of listening in to all the sort of various slightly intense Zoom meetings that were going on behind the door about, how do we try and make sure students have some semblance of a normal life while these terrible events happen in the background. But yeah, we're all very, very proud of my mum. She's deeply unflappable, fantastic as an administrator, and her first concern is always, and this is the welfare of students. That is what really animates her. So I'm extremely proud of my mum. She's a real inspiration to me and the entire family. But yes, I think she's done absolutely fantastic things with her career.
That's wonderful. Now I think it's always very admirable when people give to good causes like education and go above and beyond, especially behind the scenes in difficult times as well. So you living in rural Oxford, does that mean that they have to commute a fair bit to get to work?
Yeah, so my basically what happens at the moment is my mum spends most of the weeks in Durham and weekends at home, but it depends. Sometimes she has to stay in Durham, and my dad sometimes joins her in Durham. It depends on the term time, obviously, and things like that. So it's all a bit in flux, but I do enjoy staying in Durham. It's very nice. I'm bound to say, as a Cambridge student, not as nice as here, to make sure I don't offend any Cambridge students listening to the podcast. But it is a gorgeous town. I love it from a history point of view. In some ways, I think, just as like a historical town, it's more impressive than Cambridge. You see this amazing Gothic cathedral and castle which looms over the town. It was given, you're talking about service to education, it was given by the last Prince Bishop in 1832 to found a university and sort of been there ever since. So it's lovely. I really, and anyone who hasn't visited it, I'd say please do visit. I mean, getting to know it a lot better. It's absolutely lovely.
So I know that you appreciate the value of intellectual exchange and good debates, and I think your parents, given the nature of work that they do and perhaps their personality that they model it themselves of, I think, arguing like you're right and listening like you're wrong. So what have been particularly thought-provoking topics that continue to come up throughout your childhood, and are there any irreconcilable differences?
I'm trying to think. I'm a bit more left-wing than both of my parents. I think they have... I mean, everyone's parents have profound influence on their politics, and it's a mistake to say that they don't. I have a massive political mixture in my family. One thing I will say is I think I've learned from my dad... Like, one of the primary political instincts I have, I think, comes from my dad, which is anti-extremism. My dad is more conservative than me. Not very, but he is more conservative than me. But one thing I have learned from him is a deep hostility to using violence as a means of fixing political conflict, except in like the absolute last resort, as well as rejecting any kind of fanaticism, whether that be religious fanaticism or political fanaticism. That is like the strongest political impulse. And as much as I do, there are points of contention with my parents. I won't hide my political affiliations for campaign purposes as much as that might be advisable, but I'm somebody who is sort of centre-left. I consider myself a social democrat. That's not necessarily what my parents consider themselves, but we do share those basic impulses. So we share the basic impulse about being anti-extremists. We share the value of liberal ideals in our lives. Like, that is very much central to how my mum and my dad think about politics and think about the world. Their entire world is enabled by a system in which you can share and spread ideas freely. Those are things which still animate me, even if we have differences.
So when you say that, dad is more Catholic and dad's family is more Catholic and then mum's more Protestant...
Other way around, but yeah.
Oh, sorry, other way around. Is that just more of a cultural difference, or does that actually have a tangible effect on the day-to-day operations or running of the family?
It does not have much of it. So my dad is extraordinarily sceptical of any kind of Protestant radicalism, as you might imagine. So he comes from a Protestant family, but a moderate one. And this is not something that he sees as particularly central. Both my parents are still religious, but quite moderately. But overall, I had what could be described as like a secular humanist upbringing. Like, neither of them are very religious. My mum comes from... So my granddad is... he had an Irish father and German mother. German mother from a Catholic area, and he was sort of moderately Catholic, but became an atheist because of left-wing politics. And my mum had a slight Catholic background, not particularly strongly. So I will say that the differences are not that great between them on religious matters, and it's more about, like, I was more brought up in, like, a humanist tradition, a secular tradition. I'm somebody who, you have to endeavour to, especially with history, you have to endeavour to understand the impact of religion on people's lives, but I'm always conscious that I come from what is quite an exceptionally, like, secular background, as well as a background where both my parents are very hostile to what they see as any form of, like, fanatical religious observance. So I have to, whenever I'm a historian, I have to put myself in that mindset and also understand that my background might be having influences on it. I think it didn't best please some of my dad's family, but, I think his parents were fine with it. But for my mother, no, not any real impact. Both of my late grandma and my granddad are both very secular people, extremely secular.
As you mentioned earlier, how in history, the role and influence of religion is undeniable. So as you examine the influence of religion across different perhaps cultures or periods or time frames, has that shifted or changed or strengthened your religious views or lack thereof?
Hard question. So in terms of where I am religiously, I mean, I think I'm still fairly undecided, and I think there's no shame in saying that you're fairly undecided, by the way. If you're talking about the whole cosmology of the universe, it's fine to say that you're a little bit undecided. But I was confirmed as an Anglican back in 2014-15. I've since become more sort of... I describe myself as an agnostic.
So you're open to the possibility?
Yeah, I'm open to the possibility, but I think my primary reflection is it might be somewhat churlish of us to assume that we can even comprehend or understand the realities of the universe given our tiny place within it. But in terms of like how my study's influencing it, I'm always slightly haunted by this, in the sense that I go to John's and, I am very aware of its place within the historical tradition, Cambridge's place within the historical tradition, where Puritan radicals got together and fundamentally rethought the tenets of religious society that had defined English life for hundreds of years. And when you look at the walls in John's, you see many of these famous religious reformers. You're walking in the same buildings. I always find that interesting. So I have a few One thing I will say is there's a temptation to just sort of laugh at people who are, Puritans, iconoclasts, or extremely, stupid being... But, I think all of us are somewhat prone, at our hearts, to ideological fanaticism, to the reduction of the world, to polarisation. There are parallels. I'm struck by the parallels. I'm also struck by the parallels about, what do you do when you have a very active and vocal minority who's promoting violence and there's a compliant majority? How do you break out of that compliance? How do you find the strength within you to advocate for humanist values? So the people I admire, and I did a Reformation paper, people I admire through that period are people who fought against the odds for some degree of tolerance, who tried to fight against religious division. And I think there are lessons that we learn from that. I'm not in favour of looking at the past, and I know some people like to look at the past and laugh at people in them. We're more similar to people in the Reformation era than we think, I think. That's my reflection on it. I think that's how it influences me. But I am, at my, you should never let your own personal sympathies influence a history essay. But I will admit my own personal sympathies generally go to sort of moderate reformers or people who saw a reality of society that was being pulled apart, in Germany in particular extraordinarily violently, and tried, out of that chaos, to build some degree of unity, as hard as that would be. But yeah, I don't know, at night I get some, when you're walking through the halls of John's, it feels, you sort of feel that you're standing in a tradition that was sort of, starts in that era, and it really connects you to Reformation history.
Intellectually, I understand that we're all growing, we're evolving, and the point of reading and writing is to sharpen our thought and build the transferable skills so that we can keep changing our mind. But has there been a particular viewpoint or stance or theory or school of thought that you used to hold very dearly but now see the flaws?
It's a hard one. I think I used to be... I think what I've learned as I've studied history more is to stop taking things from any kind of dogmatic perspective and to embrace that history is in some ways a chaos. That as nice as it would be, I love nothing more than in a history essay to say there's a big structural force here, and you need to talk about this big structural force, and this is an event that was somewhat likely to happen because of X. What I think I've learnt, the more you look at history, the more you see that there is an impulse for us to rationalise what are often chaotic, irrational decisions, what are often chance events, what are often things that even the best historian can't quite see exactly its significance. So I've become very sceptical of the idea of counterfactual history, for example. I used to really believe in that as a historical tool. So the idea, there's basically the idea that you can learn something from history by thinking, if X was removed, how would I write the history backward? Which is a sort of, I'm now very sceptical that you can even do that. I think history is, in many ways, chaotic, and I think we need to move beyond the idea that decisions are motivated by entirely rational purposes. And I say that's one big historical, intellectual change I've had and been trying to do through my history is to emphasise that kind of chaos, and especially the political world.
To what extent does this chaos frustrates you?
Sorry. I'm somebody who loves to comprehend and understand things. I love nothing more than, getting to the root of a big historical puzzle, or a political puzzle, an international relation puzzle. And at some level, it'd be great and reassuring. And this goes for other areas of scholarship and life, not just history. It's great and reassuring. There's a big structural force you can talk about, or a paradigm you can just yank an explanation into. It's frustrating when that's not the case. And it's difficult when it's not the case, because then you have to accept implicitly that the world is not as ordered as you think it is. And that no amount of reading, studying, no amount of books in a library can give you a perfect understanding. And so there is a certain powerlessness within that recognition. I think it's an important recognition for historians. I think it's really a mistake for historians to try and come up with universal arguments, to not take figures individually and seriously. But yes, there's a certain powerlessness in that. That's quite scary, actually, at some level, because it sort of reminds you, not only as a historian, but what you're looking at and the chaos, and trying to make some sense out of it. But it is also scary in terms of our own actions, right? Because what you're accepting there is that it's not always easy to predict the degree your actions has, either politically, but the sort of general chaos in the world is something that's quite psychologically hard to accept, I think.
I understand that you enjoy this inherent process of embracing the chaos and trying to figure things out and propose and hypothesize and, having that intellectual humility. Is there any end goal in mind, or are you just trying to pursue capital T truth, or are you trying to gain some sense of certainty? Are you trying to get somewhere with this knowledge? Right? Why are you working so hard to try and understand the chaos and to look at different perspectives and learn?
That's a tough one, because the classic history interview answer would be, because it will help you understand the present and fix things in the present. I'm not so sure. So this is going to sound terribly simplistic, but I just kind of love history for history's sake. I think, personally, I take a great deal of enjoyment from solving these problems. It's something that wraps me up. I think it does, to some degree, help you understand the world. I don't think it's a perfect guide to it. I think people who study history as a guide to the present will find themselves, yes, you will learn useful things, but ultimately, they will find themselves disappointed. That would not be the answer I'd recommend anyone doing a history interview to give, because that is, you're meant to have a very clear idea as to exactly what history does for you. I think sometimes historians do better when they divorce it from the idea of what it does for them. What use is this? I think sometimes if you want to write something that resembles the truth, you have to embrace that degree of chaos. This is a rather vague answer, but...
So I guess context matters a lot in any sorts of study, and I guess this interview, obviously, I'm trying to to give you a platform to share your story, and if I want to give you a legacy-worthy interview, I need to respect your perspective on what's important to you, and I can only base it off the nominations form that you filled out. One of the key things you said is about growing up gay in a rural community and coming out. The floor is yours.
I can talk about that. I think the one caveat I would add to this, and this is probably not a caveat you hear very much, is that I am just extraordinarily lucky to grow up in the 2010s and 2020s. There were difficulties, of course there are difficulties, but I am at all points acutely aware that this is nowhere near as difficult as it would have been 30 or 40 years ago, where it would have been life-alteringly difficult. And it is also nowhere near as difficult as what is currently faced by transgender people, which I believe is orders of magnitude worse in terms of the press attention. There are, of course, difficulties. I'm somebody... I think initially what I found is there's this reputation for the gay community for being extreme. I think it's totally wrong, but there's still these stereotypes about it being really promiscuous, really active, and I never identified with that at all. But I was aware from when I was about 10 or 11 that I just never had any crushes on any girls and only had crushes on boys. That has remained unchanged ever since. I came out when I was 16, which I had some time to think about it over COVID, and I thought, I don't think I'm ever going to develop any crushes on any girls at this point, so I'm not bisexual. I may as well tell people about it. And every time you tell someone, it gets a bit easier. It's something I still see as it's just a fact about me. I don't think it is the whole of my identity. I think so I'm now relatively at ease with it. It was something that caused me some distress when I was growing up, but yeah. But I will caveat that by I am just totally acute, and one of the reasons I'm pretty committed to progressive politics, I'm totally acutely aware of how transformational the impact of a lot of very hard-working gay political figures who especially ingratiated themselves in the New Labour movement in the 90s and 2000s have been on the course of my life in making this from something that would have been a huge, pretty life-altering issue to something that is now regarded as a sort of fairly normal part of society, and I am immensely, immensely grateful for that. And often I feel that people don't say that enough. I think it's important to put that perspective in, if you see what I mean.
That's very mature and thoughtful and self-aware of you. So from your own, combining your intellectual studies in history and your personal experiences with it, what has contributed most to the shifts that we have seen in the past century?
This may not be a very popular answer, but there's a narrative in LGBT spaces at the moment which effectively says that the change was basically violent, that overinflates the importance of the Stonewall riots. What I think it was, in fact, is a mixture. I think there were a lot of extremely brave figures in the 70s and 80s. People like Harvey Milk, but also especially gay people within Labour, who were increasingly confident about articulating their own sexuality. And they took positions within governments with a lot of people who didn't respect them, who were not interested, and gradually shifted the political spectrum in their favour. So I think a lot of it comes down to figures in New Labour in the 90s and 2000s. So you had a big in-crop of new MPs, many of whom for the first time were openly gay, including, I think, Chris Smith, who's Master of Pembroke here, who's somebody I have enormous respect for, absolutely enormous, at a time where that was extraordinarily difficult. And these were people who gradually began to move the pendulum. So once it becomes clear that civil partnerships are not going to end the modern family as we know it, they're not going to bring social ruin as the right-wing tabloids were screaming, then people begin to normalise other ideas. I think it's also a process of previously gay people had been forced to live in the shadows of society by discrimination. And once that discrimination begins to reduce, more and more people are confident. Now, something like 1 in 15 people are gay, roughly, something like that. The vast majority of people will have a gay close friend. If people have that confidence to come out, attitudes are transformationally shifted by people's personal awareness of it, because it's no longer something that people are just aware of as a kind of straw man, thing to be scared of in a tabloid newspaper. It's their friend. It's somebody who is, normal, personable. The stereotypes get broken down. And I have a slightly Whiggish view that once that starts happening, you had a kind of snowballing progress that began to take off in 2014. Am I complacent about this progress? No. I think there are threats to it. I'm worried about the metastasization of, for example, transphobia into homophobia. I think they're deeply linked. I think they're linked rhetorically, linked to other people promoting them. I think that, especially in the United States, there's a risk that it seeps back over into increased homophobia, but it's important to take stock of just the massive progress that has happened before we devolve into sort of doomerism as a movement. But yeah, so that's a slightly moderate, Whiggish, gradualist view of things. Not necessarily the one that is most popular, I will admit, but that's my view of that.
So when you came out at 16, how much did your own intellectual readings and interpretations of it influence either the decision to come out or how you come out?
I've got to think about this. Because the reason I've got to think about this is I can't identify an exact point or reason that I came out. I think it was more that I was just thinking over COVID about, because when you get to roughly 16, you have to decide how do I want to conduct myself as an adult. You begin to think about that. You think about, if you don't take that decision now, I would have ended up, feeling pressure to, date women, and, I knew I would have been very unhappy with that. So it probably for me was not something that was that intellectual as a process. I think I do have an ability to compartmentalise. And I will freely admit that LGBT history is not my number one area of expertise in history. As you probably just heard, I do have I've got better at that. But it was rather divorced. I think it was less intellectual and more that over COVID, a lot of us had a lot of time and space to reflect by ourselves about our lives and what we wanted them to be after COVID ended. It was an odd period in that sense. I do not for a second regret it. It was a good decision for me, but it's not one that was, I would say, particularly intellectual. And to people who haven't come out yet, I would say that don't try and over-intellectualise the decision. It is something that is entirely personal. Do it at your own time, your own convenience, when you feel ready. And as much as I love to over-intellectualise everything, that's what I say as advice to my friends.
Were you surprised at the reactions or lack thereof?
I don't know. Not really. I think the truth about this, and this is in fact a product of a really good thing, is most people will not treat you that differently. There are one or two things. So for some odd reason, and I've had this with other gay people, you begin to get a lot more people asking you about their various female crushes, which I was in no position to give good advice. So unfortunately, through a lot of lower sixth, I had to be the sort of unwilling mentor to people in handling that. That's the only major behavioural change. But other than, it's luckily, I think, very rare to have people who will treat you differently. And again, that is just a sign of utterly enormous progress that I think people don't stop and take stock of enough. Because I do like to view things with longer historical lenses. That in and of itself is really significant. Really significant.
So what else did you do during school? Obviously, you've read a lot. You love debating. Did you do sport? Did you do music? Did you do drama? Did you do anything beyond thinking.
I think it won't surprise many of my friends if I say if I say somewhat modestly that I was not the best at sport.
Debating is a sport. Debating is a sport.
Well, yes, maybe debating counts, but no, I was terrible at all forms of sport, and I think I was rather stroppy about this in primary school. Probably too stroppy. I did used to do rowing in secondary school, so went along the Thames, very nice, but I was utterly terrible at it. Utterly terrible. I don't exactly have the physical strength for it, and I remember the one time I coxed the boat, I coxed it so well that it crashed into the side of the river. So that was not the main area. I was quite as you're probably gathering, I was quite a nerdy child, but I was always very into debating. So my interest in that basically started when I was 11, and the school had a little debating club, and it was mainly sixth formers, and I enjoyed absolutely nothing more and sort of, getting involved with debates with the sixth formers, and I think they were probably rather confused about why this uppity 11-year-old was kind of, challenging them vigorously. But I love that intellectual back and forth. And then with my sort of good friend Oscar, who's actually here studying medicine, we did a lot of debating competitions over the years. I think it's, for anyone considering it, even if they're not very confident, I'd say it's fantastic as an exercise in confidence, as well as an exercise in quick thinking. I absolutely love that. I also, at school, organised 2 Modern United Nations conferences, one during the height of COVID, one a week after Russia invaded Ukraine, so we didn't have a very calm backdrop to either of them. But that was fun. But I was not a, to put it very mildly, I was not a sporty child.
Were you a proud nerd?
Yes, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I gave a speech at Cult with that. I think everyone here is pretty nerdy. I'm not gonna, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying that you're interested in, you genuinely get excited by intellectual passions. And if you scratch the surface on most people here, no matter how sort of socially gregarious they are, a lot of people have that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And it should not be used it really shouldn't be used as a slur, especially by anyone here, and I in fact really admire people who are comfortable with that aspect of themselves, because everyone should be, open and comfortable, and I think nerdiness is part of that. And there are people here of just, you scratch the surface, and they are of just enormous intellectual capability, but also of genuine passion for it, and people should celebrate it, in my view.
How was arguing with Peter Hitchins and Calvin Robinson in the Orator?
Oh God. Well, no, Peter Hitchins I had met before, so we were returning to the argument. So I met him at my school in March 2022, where he was saying his usual nonsense about Ukraine, about how it was all sort of the fault of the West and all that, and it was very fun. But he is not someone who gets on very well with disagreement. Despite his rhetoric, he gets very angry when people disagree with him. Very angry indeed.
He got angry at you?
Yes, very. But that was fine.
You like that?
I will wear that as a badge of pride. Not exactly the... Yes, I think he called... What was it? A dimwit. I should write that, put it on the back. Called a dimwit by Peter Hitchins. Calvin Robinson, I think he's a... He's awful. But he's a sort of GB News host, but I'm decently persuaded he's a
When you say awful, you mean like intellectually, or...?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's a massive homophobe and all that, but, hugely xenophobic. But I'm decently convinced he's a con man, I think Peter Hitchins is somebody who's a bit of a tragic contrarian, in the sense I think he sort of genuinely believes the contrarianness, but Calvin Robinson, I think, is a con man, somebody flogging deliberately, and you can kind of tell that when you're arguing with him, because he'd have a slight smirk on his face. And I think it's always worth delineating between those two types of people. Peter Hitchins is someone I really profoundly disagree with, but I do at some level think he's holding these wrong beliefs earnestly. I don't think Calvin Robinson is. It's an interesting... Yes, but I do enjoy it, and if anyone's watching the podcast and I've taken up a political point with them in the Orator, I do apologise. I can't help it. I love that. I think that the Union and other places work best where people can really get into vigorous intellectual discussion, although not particularly possible with either of those two.
So when you argue with very intellectual people, perhaps famous figures who are obviously very accomplished for a reason, when you argue with conviction, do you only do that when you're like very, very deep down have that conviction, or do you feel like even if you're semi-sure that's what you believe, you should still present yourself as deeply, deeply convicted, if that makes sense?
I'm quite moderate in my politics, but that doesn't mean that you can't have deep convictions about what you believe in. I argue best when I have a really deep conviction in what I believe in. But what I do see, often with famous figures, and you see them coming in the union, they appreciate it when someone doesn't toady up to them. Because a lot of their life is going to be people, falling over and kissing their hand, and, people appreciate it when they see a young person, and I believe people, I know it's not always that easy to be, I'm very shy about some things, but I can be confident about going and presenting what I believe to people. And often you get quite a genuine response, maybe not from someone like Peter Hitchins, but from other figures. You get a genuine response because people are impressed that you have a conviction and that you stand by it. And for them, that's often a refreshing break from people who sort of toady up, people who are overawed by fame. And I'm someone who, for whatever reason, is not particularly overawed by fame and will treat people's views pretty equally if they're famous or not famous, or if they're significant, quote unquote, or not, because society deems them to be so. And I would encourage, I know it's not easy, but I would encourage people to, when they meet a famous figure, to not be scared about presenting their real opinion. In terms of arguing things, there are some things I'm not sure about. Perhaps one of my faults is I'm perhaps a little bit too strong-minded.
I say what I'm trying to get at is, say you go to a porter policy or whatever it is, where it's a motion where, you obviously will have natural inklings and intuitions and thoughts, but you perhaps haven't thought deeply, or you don't really have that deep conviction, and then you make it. Would you then go make a speech based on your currently you're not totally sure deep down, but would you still then make a seemingly convicted speech, or would you just not speak and wait for a topic that you feel very confident?
I get that. The honest answer is I love speaking even when I'm deep down not too sure.
Okay, but you appear very sure.
I think there are differences in how sure I feel. So I give the best speeches when I'm arguing from something from real conviction, especially ideological conviction. So I think the best speech I've given was actually at my school, which was to a UN conference, which was about Ukraine, for example. And you can definitely tell, I can tell from other people's speeches as well, the degree of conviction that's there. Unfortunately, I love speaking publicly, not so much on an interpersonal level, weirdly, but so I will. I think it's one of my faults that I do speak even when it's probably not a good idea. I wouldn't advise that for other people, but I'm aware that's a fault I have.
That's wonderful. And in terms of Mum's work as Vice-Chancellor of Durham, what else have you seen through her that has made you appreciate perhaps higher education and the education industry in particular? Because obviously you have that personal perspective of her as mum, but you also recognise that she is essentially the Stephen Toop equivalent for Durham.
But I will say she became Vice-Chancellor of Durham quite recently. So for most of my childhood, my formative years, she was, both her and my dad were academics of English, and don't worry, I think most of the lessons I drew from them were from their personal characteristics rather than their academic backgrounds. What I will say is it probably has instilled, from my mum specifically, I think what it's instilled from me, she is somebody who is immensely resilient. Immensely. She's somebody who can, and I've watched this, and I watched this during COVID, because she was running she's somebody who can fight through pretty terrible circumstances and remain calm. And that's important to me as well. Resilience is an important characteristic. And the other thing is probably she's somebody who sees herself primarily through liberal values because of what she studies, and I think that has an influence.
Resilience, why... well, I guess, no, that's a bad question. I was going to ask, why does it matter? Well, of course it matters, but can you give some other examples of perhaps where you're really proud of your resilience growing up?
Well, I don't know. What I mean about resilience is that I think I really admire people who are not afraid to admit they've gone through difficult circumstances but can come through the other side of them. I didn't have at various points I didn't have a particularly easy adolescence at all. you know, like, I'm probably totally unrecognisable from where I was 16, 17. Like, so much happier.
Wow.
But it takes quite a lot to, like, fight through. But at my core, I'm a fighter. I'm somebody who believes that when life throws things at you, there is this enormous, and you see it through history, there's this enormous human capacity for resistance and resilience, which is something that I don't think is stressed enough. I think a lot of people have quite extraordinary ability to resist bad circumstances within them. History is littered, yes, it's littered with stories of compliance, but it's also littered with acts of extreme bravery and people going through unimaginable hell and coming out the other side. And I've been exceptionally lucky to grow up broadly in a secure household, but I'm aware people haven't, and I do really prize people's ability to sort of fight through circumstances, and I try and internalise them. It's not always easy, but I try and internalise in my life that whatever life throws at you, things can and do get better, because I think there is this extraordinarily human capacity of people to overcome.
So if I met you just before that turning point, what would I see, and what would my impressions be?
Oh, I don't know. Hard to know.
Well, I guess
I used to be a little bit. So I'm somebody who, at my, I'm a little bit awkward, and a little bit shy. So sometimes I take some prodding for social interaction, but it was broadly more sort of like privately. I wasn't very happy, rather than a public thing. I'm quite good at putting on a public face sometimes. But yes, no, I've definitely got more gregarious since being at Cambridge. I do apologise to anyone if I've been awkward. It's probably not deliberate. But yeah, that's what I'd say.
What kind of report card comments did your teachers give you? Like, what adjectives did they use to describe you?
This is testing my memory. Well, they would generally think I was sort of very bright and engaged and intellectual, but I think I had some more prodding from teachers to, you know, get more involved in the social life of the school. That was the general feedback.
Right. So you just prefer to go read and do homework?
Yeah, no, in
Debate. Primary
school I used to, this is a bit odd, but I used to just sort of sit in the corner and read sometimes.
Wow.
So I'm definitely more gregarious than I was. And sometimes, you know, I think everyone needs a bit of time to recharge, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm definitely someone who has to learn, because I don't think it's something that's immediately obvious when you meet me, right? Because I'm somebody who will sort of stand up and do tons of speeches even when it's really inadvisable, and he's probably annoying the chair. But on a social level, I'm somebody who can in fact be quite shy, thinks a lot about things, can be quite introverted. And there are like complicated layers to people. I'd say that no one is entirely extroverted or introverted. And I'm often someone who sort of needs some alone time or feels a little bit overwhelmed in some social interactions. So I think there's no shame in admitting those difficulties either. But yeah, it's not immediately obvious because oddly, I have this sort of conceptual space in my head where I've never had particular issues with public speaking. But I have had issues in terms of just like social interaction and feeling shy and a bit overwhelmed.
If I haven't mistaken, you mentioned your sister.
Yes.
She is a few years older than you?
Yes, so she's 4 years older than me. I mean, she's absolutely amazing. I have great admiration for my sister, but she is unfortunately a philosopher. We will forgive that. But she is 4 years older than me. She's just finished a degree in St Andrews. She's going to come and do a degree in Oxford next year, which is great. She's also in the competitive debating world. She's much better at it than me, I have to say. But she's great. I have a good relationship with my sister, even if there are definitely intellectual differences, let's say. But no, she is an extraordinary force of nature. I have a huge amount of respect for my sister, but she's a very, very kind and loving person as well.
That's wonderful. She sounds amazing. When you grew up then, what was the dynamic in the household and what was the relationship like?
I probably wasn't a very good younger brother, I have to say. I think she probably put up with me. But I have we were very close growing up. Very close growing up indeed.
She was a trusted person when you faced difficulties?
Yes, she was. And but it's always a matter of, you know, when I was the youngest in the household, so older sister obviously gets some other responsibility, but not too much, I think, hopefully. And we were we went to the same school when she was in sixth form, and she'd always sort of buy me sandwiches. And, you know, even though I was 13, 14 by that point, you know, she'd always make sure I was sort of fed and watered. You know, that was she's a very, very concerned person.
And you mentioned before the intellectual differences between you two. What are they?
That was a slight joke, but it was more that she is a big philosophy buff, and that's not something I'm particularly never found the energy to really get into. I remember there was one she probably I should probably get slightly annoyed at mentioning this, but I remember there was one beach holiday we were doing where she was scrawling bits of Wittgenstein's Tractatus into the sand.
So like language games.
Yes, yep. She loves linguistic philosophy. She's somebody who has a natural aptitude for languages. I did German and Latin A level, but I think natural would be a stretch in terms of my language aptitude. I've forgotten a lot of my German already, but she's somebody with a real linguistic aptitude. She writes fantastic poetry, really good. She spends a lot of her spare time doing translations of Apollinaire into fantastic English, I have to say, and writing German short stories. So she's more on that end. I'm more on the sort of slightly, more on the historical end. That's the serious answer to that.
Very nice. In terms of your personality, then has it? Would you say it's changed much? However you define personality.
Well, it depends what you mean by change, because
obviously we evolve, we grow, but
I'm trying to think about that. I think I was a little bit more, as I was saying, I was introverted, and I went through a really bad period in my life when I was about 16, 17, probably didn't help. But ultimately, one aspect that's unchanged about my personality is I'm somebody who, you get what you see. I'm not someone who puts on superficial facades for people. Often that can seem a little bit brusque, and I apologise if it does, but I'm not good at putting on or faking my personality. At my heart, I've always been somebody who's been very nerdy, nothing wrong with that, but also somebody who I hope is forthright, but I also hope is somebody with a capacity for kindness. At least we should all endeavour to that. You know, I'm making sure that during this campaign I'm putting my friends first and things like that. That is really important to me. I'm also somebody who's, I think, a little bit more soppy and soft than people might realise on the outside personality, which is, again, fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But yeah, I've definitely got more gregarious. I think I've always kept in mind to watch it with, the Cambridge politics world about, don't compromise. And I would say this to everyone: never compromise your personality for Colk or for CUUNA or for Cougar or the Union or anything. Don't. It's not worth doing that. It's not worth sacrificing bits of yourself. And yes, it's not perhaps the typical sort of what hacks, quote unquote, are meant to do, because you're meant to put on these sort of facades for various societies, but I always find that too draining, and I'm always very mindful of staying true to myself, and that's extremely important. That has always been important to me.
That's wonderful. I guess I need some of your help. Obviously, I have a responsibility for this to give you a legacy-worthy interview, capturing what's important for you to listen back to. And you obviously mentioned about being honest and, just being honest and not sacrificing and not delving away from difficult topics. But I also obviously, as a human being, as a person, I have a duty of care as well. But so you mentioned on your form that about overcoming difficult situations, regarding disability and perhaps anxiety. I was just wondering, do you want to talk about
Yeah, sure, I can talk about that. The one caveat I will give is that I think a lot of people have been through difficult circumstances. So this is not for me to say that I've been through uniquely very difficult circumstances. I'm very aware of this. A lot of people were extremely badly hit by the COVID pandemic, have circumstances they don't talk about. So that's one thing I'll caveat. But I've always had some issues. I mean, I was quite mentally not in a great place during sixth form. I developed depression, which I think a lot of people did over the COVID pandemic. It's something I was able to overcome. Which is surprising, because when you're going through it, what is a common feature, and I've talked to other people who've been through it, a common feature of this is the belief that you just feel like it's never going to end, right? You feel you're in the middle of this massive tunnel, which is just going to be your life. And you won't come out the other side. No matter what anyone can say, people don't think they will. And what I will say to people who are going through it is things do and can get better, which is a mantra which will probably sound extremely cheesy and wrong to anyone actually going through it right now. I understand that. But things do. And it takes the love and support of your friends and your family, and I feel bad for, having to rely on that during that period. I feel that, people have this capacity, people generally have your best interests at heart and will pull you up. It's important to rely on your community for that when that happens. And I don't think this is an entirely atypical experience. Like, COVID really hit a lot of people very badly. I was somebody who was already somewhat struggling with, making sure I wasn't lonely, and, coronavirus didn't help that. But yeah, it was difficult, but it was something that I'm very thankfully, and I count my blessings this every day, that thankfully that I'm something that no longer really dogs my life. And that is obviously something I couldn't have anticipated when I was 17, which is, the fact that I'm actually in Cambridge and I'm having election or low election, I'm having something that can be described as a quite happy, fulfilling life at the moment, is something that I wouldn't have believed at a certain point. So I will say to people that life has its odd ebbs and flows and chances. Things never go in a straight trajectory. There's no shame in anyone admitting that they've been through these difficulties, and things do generally tend in the direction of working out, even if it doesn't seem like that at the time.
Are struggles inevitable?
I think, yes, to some level. I don't think, depressive level struggles are inevitable. I think there's an issue in Cambridge culture, right, which is that you sort of see it if you peruse through canvas from various people, that there's an assumption that going through really extreme mental stress should be part of their degree. I think that's an attitude we should move away from. This is going to sound, probably awful from a Cambridge perspective, but do not sacrifice yourself on an altar of academic success. It shouldn't be normalised or accepted that a degree of struggle that induces depression or anxiety disorder should be a normal part of the Cambridge degree. I think perceptions are improving on this, but the sort of really toxic, hustle culture within Cambridge is something that I think I have seen, grind people down. So I wouldn't normalise it in that sense. I would normalise it in the sense that if somebody's going through it, I know a lot of people, I felt quite intense shame. And the vast majority of people correctly would never treat anyone worse for going through a mental health struggle. And it should be normalised in that sense. What shouldn't be normalised is that it cannot be seen as a natural consequence or a good consequence. If your degree is making you develop those symptoms, or if your workload is making you develop those symptoms, that there is a fundamental cultural problem, right? That's what I will say about that.
And is there a fundamental cultural problem at Cambridge?
I think to some degree, yes. I think that it's partly a feature of people who are very, very talented can often push themselves to oblivion, or can be quite flawed in some levels, or neglect other aspects of themselves. So it's partly a feature of that rather than the university. And I think no matter what the cultural changes at the top of the university systems are, but I think there are issues in all universities with mental health support. So universities in particular, I think, I personally believe they should be given, they should have a statutory duty of care to their students. I believe that occasionally you see too much largesse. I think especially during COVID, there are some utterly horrific stories of students just totally let down. And I know professionals here in Cambridge work extremely hard, but, they can only do so much. And A, there needs to be a cultural change. And B, there just needs to be more investment. There needs to be more staff. It needs to be prioritised as an aspect of the university. And that's not just... In fact, I think Cambridge is, in fact, one of the least applicable for this criticism. There are some universities with pretty dreadful mental health support that need more.
Big issues facing... everyone, and they're very structural, I guess you would consider. So you were nominated by one of your good friends, Gabriel, and on the form he wrote on why you've been nominated, and I think it might be nice to capture why you have been nominated. He wrote, I am nominating Sammy McDonald from St John's, Cambridge, Sammy gave a paper speech in week 2 of his term in the Union on energy nationalisation and went viral defending nationalisation, viewed over 80,000 times on Twitter and 500,000 times on TikTok. Since then, he has become debates officer for CUUNA, having run 2 model UN conferences during the COVID-19 pandemic at school and a week after the war in Ukraine. He is also planning on running for debates officer at the Cambridge Union. Tell me about the viral speech. What did you say and what happened? And is it all a bit of a blur?
It's all a bit of a blur. Unfortunately, the Twitter views were closer to 800,000 rather than 80. So it was probably
800.
I feel very vain correcting that. That was, in fact, not an entirely. It's not an entirely good thing. I was entirely thrilled about going viral on Twitter because it's not where you want to go viral given the people on it. Deeply weird. I had no anticipation that was going to happen. So, rather foolhardily, I decided, I looked at the term guide and thought I could give a good speech on that. So, slightly foolhardy, I went to then debates officer Sam Carling. Something possessed him to give me the slot. And I gave a rather dramatic speech because there were sort of 2 rather gormless-looking energy bosses sitting over there. And I was sort of lambasting them for their failures. And this was October 2022. The country was in what can only be described as a slightly febrile, slightly difficult political mood at that point. So what happened is the lady I was speaking with said, "Oh, I really like that speech. Can I put it on my socials?" And I assume she meant her personal socials. So yeah, sure, go ahead. She put it on her company socials. Went from there. All started exploding out of control. I can only describe it as utterly surreal. I still haven't got my head around it. Very weird. I mean, the weirdest one, the one that brought it... I tried not to read the comments. So there was a comment which was very weird, which is, "Oh, I know him from the bus." Which sort of puts a perspective on it. But I also got some very interesting comments about how I was Boris Johnson's secret love child. Which, whilst funny, made me slightly horrified. The comparison was not appreciated. I also got, this was the best comment, and I honestly totally respect this commenter. So he said, "I agreed with everything he said." Good. But, serious but, he said he was wearing a clip-on bow tie. So his opinion, disregarded. So you always get these weird, because you're entering this morass of all these various different opinions and odd people, and I sort of thought as an authentic reaction, that really took the miss. He got a very negative response online, that comment, but I thought, respectable. Somebody sticking to his guns, He's dying on that hill.
What did you actually advocate for those who haven't listened?
So, the United Kingdom has an energy system which can only be described as a disaster, in the sense that we sold off most of our energy storage in the decade before the energy crisis precipitated. We have a very expensive system which essentially revolves around periodical and regular bailouts of private companies. It also involves those private companies often blackmailing and threatening to turn on and off supply in order to raise premium from the central government. Nationalisation or no nationalisation, that is an extraordinarily unacceptable state of affairs, because what it meant is that we're still, as taxpayers, footing the bill through increased taxation and reduced spending in other areas from the failure of the system to adapt to the energy shock. So, as a country, we were, on paper, better positioned for an energy shock, right? Because we get most of our oil and gas from Norway, which was unaffected. But the issue we had is because you have this sort of, what I describe, I think, as this Byzantine apparatus, we can't react to any kind of shock. So we can't buy up extra supply, really. We then have to pay tens of billions. These companies are extremely febrile and default at the slightest shock. You have to raise bills more. They have more of a capacity to force the central government to raise bills more. So, especially in an era where we're going to be having to deal with very periodical energy shocks, like it or not, we're heading towards an era of almost constant energy crisis. We're going to have to decarbonise, uproot the entire economy from the foundations of industrialisation quite rapidly. We're going to get to net zero by 2050. And the idea that we can persist with this sort of extraordinary mess, a mess which is basically was propagated for an ideological project that has failed, I believe very strongly, and I'm not even that left-wing on economics, but I believe very strongly, like half of conservative voters, by the way, that the sensible solution is that for something where there is an actual monopoly, like energy, like water, but especially energy, we need some kind of national oversight and control. And that what should have been done is, instead of handing over tens of billions, a huge bill to these companies and saying, run off now, we should have demanded shares in return for that. and it should have been brought under as kind of centralised apparatus. I think Labour is partly there. I think the GB energy thing that Starmer announced at the conference is very good. But yeah, I do feel strongly about that, especially because, people were... I was talking in October, and thank God energy prices began to fall after that on the European level. But we were looking at a position where people were going to be left not able to heat their homes. There were suggestions that we're going to have rising pneumonia death tolls, and it was having a massive, and it still is, but it was having a massive impact on the price of food, various goods at a time where people were already squeezed. And there was no willingness in the central government because of this sort of dogmatic weddingness to privatisation, even when they were handing over tens of billions without any consequence. There was absolutely no willingness for any kind of central reform. And I think that was part of the reason, I think I looked at the opinion polls of this, it's like 75% of the electorate agreed with that view. People were feeling particularly angry, as you might imagine, around October 2022. So I think it's a question we still need to look at. Thank goodness, I think we've got over the worst of the energy crisis. It might come back next winter. Energy bills are still unacceptably high. Food inflation is running extremely high. But it's something that we can't just wait until the next crisis to deal with. We have to actually have a contingency and emergency plan. Energy shocks are a constant feature of history even before climate change. And God knows we're going to have more of them. So... But yes, it is something I feel passionately about, and it was really good to be able to, virality on overrides, it was really good to be able to actually communicate that. I don't think Gabriel agrees, though. In the video, he's kind of scowling in the background, so I appreciate the nice words he wrote about it. At the time, he did not look impressed.
Wow, I'm just sitting here in awe at just how eloquently you're able to articulate your views on the spot. It's incredible.
I think it's the coffee. It's the copious consumption of coffee, I think.
Why do you personally think it went viral to get to 800,000 views? Was it the way, the mannerism that you talked, or was it the viewpoint that you expressed, or was it I guess we're looking at this historical event. Why did it happen?
So when was this? This was about a week before Liz Truss resigned. To put it mildly, the government's approval was slightly worse than Stalin. Yes, of course it was partly that. The second aspect is, I think people were feeling desperately worried. The government had just crashed the economy on the altar of a ludicrous experiment based on anachronistic beliefs about the economy. Anachronistic, arcane beliefs that are fine when they're written by some Telegraph columnist. But suddenly they've happened. People have implemented them. Interest rates skyrocketed. People were worried about the ability to pay their mortgage, to pay for their fuel bills. Inflation was forecast to run out of control because of this gross fiscal experiment that was being done on the country. I was deeply angry. I think most of the country was furious about people with no real experience, with no real sense of economic suffering, experimenting on the population. And one of the biggest aspects of this was the failure to do anything about energy. So they had a kind of fairly superficial cap, which was it was one of the worst policies I think I've ever seen. It effectively said to energy companies, right, here's this blank check, and we're going to give you tens and tens of billions. This is going to come, directly out of taxpayers' pockets, and you're not going to be, no reforms. We're not going to demand anything in return. And that was, I think, an infuriating event, not just for me. People were deeply worried about how to get through that winter. So to have somebody, articulate that frustration obviously goes for, the internet partly reflects that reality. Second aspect of this is, I think, I saw this in the comments, people always slightly, obviously it's ridiculous to anyone in the Cambridge politics world to imply that everyone in Cambridge is a massive conservative, but, of course you can see how that perception builds up. And what you often see in the comments is the contrast between this sort of rather scrawny looking person in messy black tie, the sort of left-wing opinions they're expressing. And that was the sort of it's an odd contrast.
It's a clipped-on bow tie, though.
Yeah, well, exactly. Someone noticed the force within. But you see what I'm driving at. There's always a curiosity when that happens, especially because of, what Boris Johnson has done to the influence of to the reputation of the Oxford Union. Cambridge is not the Oxford Union, but it's in a similar sort of sphere. So those are the two things that I think were responsible. I think if the speech was given at any other time, it wouldn't have gone viral. I think that was the catalyst.
So that anger that you felt and perhaps still feel when a bad policy gets made, what proportion of that anger comes from your intellectual your intellectual kind of disagreement versus the practical implications that you believe those policies will have on everyday people?
That's a hard thing to delineate. I mean, at my core, I'm not an ideologue. I get most angry at politics which experiment on people for the sake of ideology. And that's what I see Trussism as. I know, to be honest, most of my friends are what can be described as moderate Tories. My objection is not to people who see institutions or financial institutions wants to conserve them for the purposes of spreading economic growth and laying the foundations of, stability of democracy. That's not my objection. My objection to what Trussism was doing was it was taking a distorted version of an ideology that wasn't even accurate. There's not even an accurate reputation of Thatcherism. And rolling it out on the nation at scale in such a way that cost people who were already struggling because of the effects of the economic mismanagement, who were already struggling, it was costing them hundreds and thousands of pounds. It was driving people to really extreme poverty. It was meaning people having to skip meals. It was skyrocketing food bank uses. And what really got me was the contrast between Liz Truss, who's sort of sitting in London with all of the people from the Institute of Economic Affairs who can do that, who can sign that with a pen, and turn around, reverse it all with no contrition, no apology, after enormous damage, and the realities of the suffering it was causing. And this is what gets me about Johnsonism too. I think Boris doesn't view politics as anything more than a parlour game he plays with his friends. Or as Keir said, and I think rightly, keys to a palace that he can show around and parade to his friends. He never actually views politics as something that might affect real people. And wake up, he was Prime Minister during a pandemic. Suddenly, it's not so funny anymore. It's not a union job that he can sort of, mess up and have a good laugh about with his Bullingdon Club friends. It's real. It's people's lives. It's the whole future of the nation. And both of them are totally ungrounded from the realities of what they were doing because they view politics as a game for clicks. They view it as a game, basically a parlour game. And that's what gets me. I'm most attracted to politicians who say that my most important job in this is to accurately improve the conditions of people, to really improve the conditions of people on the ground. It's not an ideological game that I can show off. And I don't think this is necessarily like a Conservative Labour point either. You see tons of people in the Labour Party and tons of people in the Tories who basically see the job either on the far left of the Labour Party as like an ideological thing where we can demonstrate how right and socialist we are. It doesn't matter like if that crashes the economy. Or on the Conservatives either power for its own sake in the case of Boris or this sort of neoliberal experiment. And I get very angry at people who experiment on the population, people with no regard for like the actual impacts of their policies, or people who prioritise ideological purity over the reality. I think a lot of politics is about facing up to realities, but also understanding that you're there at the behest of people who put you there, and nothing more.
So if we take this line of thought that the real reality is what should matter most rather than sticking, say, so-called true to your ideology and then experimenting at all costs.
Yeah.
Does that mean that if we can take you across time, if we put you in different countries or different periods of time, you would shift from like left-wing to right-wing to moderate, like depending on the context? Or do you feel like it doesn't, one ideology is probably what you should be?
Yeah, this is a thought experiment I love to play with my friends about what we would have done in various historical situations. It's so hard to know because all of our beliefs are so informed by our context, is what I always say when we try and play this. So we can never really know. I think my historical sympathies generally are with like reformers, so people who see systems, want to reform them, but like reject immediate calls like insurrection, or so the sort of Girondin, slightly boring, but people who actually put the hard graft in. It's very hard to know, though. I think I would have been pretty at home in the sort of Liberal Party, I think, on the slightly more radical end of it. But I'm not somebody who would have been generally at the barricades except against like very extreme systems. But yeah, it really, as I love to play this sort of game and ask my friends about what they would have. You get some quite surprising answers, but you do have to stay mindful at all times, especially as a historian, that all your beliefs are deeply informed by your context and what you grew up with. And, I grew up with basically a story of British political chaos unfolding from when I was first politically aware, and that informs what I think. So my first political memories are 2015, 2016. I remember 23rd of June is my birthday, which is also the referendum day. I remember it ruined my birthday in perpetuity, as I often like to joke. But I remember, watching David Cameron resign, the power crash. That's one of my seminal political memories. And, watching through 2018-19, the whole system went up in flames. And then watching again in 2022 as Boris self-immolated. And, I think that's obviously had an impact on, my general preference for stability. But yes, it is very. I wrote, if you have historian friends, ask them. You get surprising answers for various historical situations.
So an underlying current that, I guess, connects the thread of all these problems that you're facing is politicians who play, in your own words, like ideology games and experiment on the masses and ignore and neglect reality. Are most politicians like that? And if so, why does modern or politics in general just attract those type of people?
So it's, in my view, one of the primary problems of the British way we draw politicians, right? So in Britain, we draw them, in both Labour and Conservative circles, from an extremely narrow, London-based set of high society people. People, very small, self-contained group of chums. So people who write for the right newspapers, who work in the right think tank worlds, all of these very close-knit circles, people who don't really, I think anyone who's a politician, like an actual politician, not sort of, student role, should be grounded in their community. And it's a problem that is not just related to the Conservatives, because, a lot of Labour people call it out. Worth remembering, Tony Blair was MP for Sedgefield. He had never walked in the place. He'd never grew up there. He was just transplanted from London Party. And this is the problem. You have a group of people who essentially are brought up to view politics as a kind of game, and who have no connection to their local vicinities and areas. So what is needed, really, is a return to some kind of localist politics, ensuring that, yes, it's regrettable that the Conservatives won all those seats in the northeast. That breaks my heart because I think they betrayed those seats. But look at that carefully. Corbyn's Labour, was it really representing the northeast? Or was it actually a narrow set of London student associations who were dictating policy? And look at the kind of MPs who were elected in the northeast, in northwest Durham, in Bishop Auckland. They came from those communities. There are people who could actually say, and Jill Mortimer in Hartlepool, and it's worth, actually taking the lesson that people responded well to people who came from those communities, represented their views, rather than imposing a kind of London student-set dogma on the population. So I think we need to move towards that kind of more localist politics. So that's where the primary problem with that, attitude of politics as a game comes from, I think. It's people like Boris and Truss. Boris and Truss, very different personalities, left power for very different reasons. But in my view, the problem is the same. The problem is that neither of them really actually have a sense of the impact of their own politics, and come into politics and see it mainly as a press game, and see it mainly as a point scoring exercise. And I mean, I'm not 100% on board with the Labour leadership, but I do think one of Keir Starmer's strengths is that, to his credit, he realises A, Twitter is not real life, and B, it's Labour has to learn that lesson. It has to actually reflect local communities' interests and be primarily oriented not around ideological dogma, but delivering for people. And that's how it restores its reputation.
And what are your thoughts on, Western democracies where elections are every 3 to 5 years? And does that impede the incentive for long-term planning, or are politicians just primarily short-term driven?
I think it's one of the sort of necessary evils we have to take for a democratic system, that whilst it's tempting to shake your fist and say, democracy has, suddenly oriented around short-termism, politicians who prioritise their short-term needs is a constant feature of everything, from 17th century politics to 21st. I think it's slightly overestimated as a drawback. So US House elections being every 2 years is ridiculous, because what you see is, nothing ever gets done in the US House. You just see people just screaming for ideological purposes, and they're often quite sensible behind the scenes, but it's all about the TikTok clip. But I think it's a general feature of politics more generally. So even in a dictatorial system, right, the pressure to deliver short-term results, to curry favour with the narrow caster and the leader, to generate what is required, which is a constant stream of superficial good publicity, is acting as a kind of similar incentive. So I'm not necessarily persuaded that it's inherently a feature of a democratic system with elections every 4 years. I do think there are going to be more issues with. I think the rise of short-termism has more to do with social media stuff right at the moment. But yeah, no.
Of which you're a contributor of.
Yes, unfortunately. No, I might add not willingly. I think that I'm an advocate of political debates being longer and more depth, and don't listen. I'm a hypocrite about this, but do not get news, in my view. If I have any advice to anyone, don't get news from Twitter or Instagram or TikTok. Listen to people, listen to speeches, listen to the full things they have to say. Because there is an issue that politics is being compressed into narrow and narrow sound bites. This is a process that's been underway before social media. I think reached its height in many ways under Blair, but is continuing because of social media. And
is that just human nature though, that people just are lazy?
Yeah, no, partly it is, and also partly we should. There's this narrative of...
And people don't have... Not everyone has the time to read academic journals and to think and to critique and then to analyse and to have supervision. There are, as you said, daily realities of feeding your family.
Yeah. Yes, I'm going to say... Yes.
So yes, the ideal world is everyone would be so rational that they could have all the information they need. But, back to your point, we need to be grounded in reality. Is that people have limited attention span.
Yes.
People have limited time. So how do we then ensure that the population progresses with the right information?
I'm going to contradict myself a little bit in the sense that I think the short-termism, as you say, is partly just a feature of politics since time immemorial. There's no such thing, and I know a lot of historians get angry at this, as this perfect democratic world that we've left, where everyone was sort of educated like a scholar, speaking on great issues all the time.
Education is also not neutral, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, but I think there are things we can do. I think what I find effective is, please never say, I won't talk to someone because of their political affiliation, even if you find them pretty extreme. And, I'm a big advocate of that. I'm a big advocate of talking to, I'm not a conservative. I get on perfectly well with conservatives. They might have things, and they give me new perspectives and insights. And I will say to people, and you see a lot of very left-wing people at Cambridge do this to their credit, sit down, be willing to make friendships with people who disagree with you politically. Because when you get into a death spiral, which happens in, countries which are polarising, which again is not a process exclusive to the 21st century at all, people begin to see that as, your politics not aligning with mine means I can't talk to you. I think that's dangerous. And I think one thing we can do, again, this goes back to what I was saying much earlier in the interview about the importance of friendships in changing political minds. Making friends and having long conversations with people who come from opposing political views is one thing we can do. But as you say, it's not entirely a feature of social media. There's a massive penchant on various columns to say, well, it's all to do with TikTok and, the shortening of the political attention span. That's partly true, but it's also partly polarisation follows economic dispossession. What we've seen, and I think is far more important in the United States, is and the United Kingdom is the stagnation in living standards, people feeling their children can't be richer than them, and this is a really powerful force in driving people towards more extreme political perspective. We've seen it in the past without social media, and this is what we're seeing now. And rowing against the forces of polarisation is always something that's going to be really difficult and requires having a degree of political maturity that's often quite difficult, but I think a lot of it comes from, I think we need to increase political engagement, but we also need to ensure that, in our own lives, that we don't prejudice friendships on the basis of political affiliation, because I think we get into really dangerous places when we start doing that.
I remember reading an FT or Economist article last year. To understand modern British politics, we need to look at the Oxford Union in the 1980s. So obviously, so many of the British politicians have come through those circles, and the Cambridge or Oxford Union are often critiqued as so-called training grounds for the next generation, and apparently there's even an underground tunnel to Westminster, which may or may not be true, I'm not sure. So you having, I guess, the positionality now of being a part of the Cambridge Union and, are currently amidst your campaign for debates officer.
Yes.
Is that a valid kind of observation that Oxford and Cambridge Union are basically the next generation of leaders, and what implications does that have based on
in my view? I think people who are running for the Cambridge Union with the view to it being a viable political launchpad are sadly living in the wrong decade. And I don't think there's anything, in fact, I think that's probably positive. But it's in my view, if people are using it as a political jump pad, at the moment, I think that's delusion. I think that both Labour and the Conservatives are getting better at getting people from local communities. It would be horrific training for politics, to be honest, horrific. It's not the skills you want. Because essentially, Cambridge Union, right, end of the day, whoever becomes debate officer, things will take forward fine, because there's a board of trustees who controls the finances. Unless you do something absolutely horrific, you're not going to invite catastrophic consequences. That just doesn't fly in the real political world. And also, it's this sort of hyper... I like to compare it to sort of Chicago, because it's like this these sort of hyper cliques and, intrigue and backrooms and, which, again, doesn't really, politics, yes, can be brutal, but isn't that, insular. But yes, I think if you're under any kind of illusions... to be honest, I'm mainly doing it because I enjoy debates, but as you probably can tell, I enjoy this kind of discussion for its own sake. I am under absolutely no illusions that this is that I think Boris has sufficiently burnt the ability of this to act as any kind of career bridge. And in any case, the Cambridge Union's bridge to that was always very weak, even weaker now. But yes, there is a problem. I think if people were to... I don't think even people who think you're getting into politics in Cambridge Union think like this anymore. But if you aren't going to use the Cambridge Union or Oxford Union as a guide to get into politics, I think it does teach all the wrong lessons. I think it does teach that politics is basically a factional popularity contest.
When you say wrong lessons, I think there's a distinction between their actions having a bad consequence on other people versus them not getting elected. For some of those people, if they're purely self-driven and power-hungry, then for them, as long as they are elected, then they have got there. Are you saying that they won't even get elected, or is when they get elected, they just won't be good governors?
There are two things I'm driving at. So one, I think it's outmoded in the modern world. I think the results of 2019, but also the general backlash to the Boris Cameron-style politics, in my view, is going to sweep away various tenets of chumocracy. So if you're looking at the way of managing politics, which is all about this kind of superficial game of chums, that is not going to be in vogue for much longer, I think. I fully expect there's going to be a next Labour government. And Starmer is not, he's not that, radical about many things. One of the things he is radical about, if you read his writings, is getting rid of the residue of this chumocracy. He feels very strongly about that. He is somebody who made his way up through the legal profession and is an advocate of professionalisation of politics. So from a purely selfish point of view, I don't think the kind of ways you win a Cambridge election... And I think some people take it too seriously anyway, that's another discussion. But the kind of ways you win a Cambridge election is not the kind of ways that, in my view, is likely to engender political success. I think a lot of this kind of politics is living on borrowed time. The second thing is, on a personal level, I don't think it's teaching the right lessons. It's not actually worth blowing up a friendship for a minor position within the Cambridge Union. And it's not actually worth all of the... I really try very hard to ensure that I'm, not damaging my own health or any of my campaign or anything like that, or any of the other candidates. But I've seen a lot of people who've been really severely bruised by what is people taking something way too seriously. And as a lesson, as a student, as a life lesson, I can't endorse that. I hope to be able to provide some degree of cultural change. And I think that starts with people taking themselves less seriously.
So, because we're doing back to that back, I have a set of, I guess, very general unique questions just out of fairness.
Yes, of course.
You've touched on some of the things, but so it might sound a bit repetitive. So if it does, feel free to just add something new. But I just want to give you a set of common questions.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So I think the first one would be just given all the things that you have mentioned, why have you decided to put yourself forward as a candidate for debates officer of the Cambridge Union?
Primarily because I just love debating. Simple as that. I'm somebody who can genuinely point to the fact that throughout my entire life, I've seen value in, dedicated time to, and will put passion in, to the art of debating, to intellectual discussion, to facilitating that, and to making that productive. That is something that has animated a lot of my school life, still animates me personally now. And I think that's the most important thing. The second thing I think I can say is, as I was sort of touching on, I think I'm somebody who's quite well equipped to deliver various degrees of cultural change. I'm somebody who, at my core, is non-factional, who doesn't take the side of whatever a set social group wants, who is not receptive necessarily to peer pressure, sometimes to my detriment personally. I'm not typical within a lot of this world. I'm somebody who can genuinely actually centralise passion for debates in the debates office, and that. There are some fantastic debates officers. I think most people in the union are fantastic one-on-one actually as well. But I hope to be able to simultaneously deliver that cultural change, as well as foster good speakers, foster good debate. Another reason I want to do it is I think there is a sort of somewhat of a crisis of access. I think the union has a reputation, a very negative reputation, that sometimes precludes access to speakers. And that would be my primary focus each week, would be getting speakers from unconventional places, prioritising first-time speakers, primarily. So I really want to do it, but I think for that reason. But I think the most important reason is what sounds overly simplistic, but is just putting passion for debates, argument, at the very heart of the union. And that being the primary motivation and not social aggrandisement. That's what I want.
Could you, in your own words, narrate your own union journey? Like, when did you know about it? When did you start? What role? And what just some of the key milestones that have led you up in your union career?
Yes. So first week I travelled along with two school friends, one's called Nihal, one's called Oscar, to the no confidence debate. And we would do, they have a, annual tradition of no confidence debates, and Johnny Hayward and a few other people I remember were speaking. And I rather foolhardily stuck my hand up and launched what can only be described. Lara somehow, I think, made the mistake of picking me and launched quite a vicious attack on Liz Truss and the entire Conservatives, and it got a very big reaction, and it was very nice, but it was slightly daunting because it was first week. Second, it was I think it was the second weekend, it might have been the third, I can't remember. Energy debate happened. I sort of rather, I think, foolhardily put my name down, trundled in, did a little audition with Sam Carling, so something possessed him to give me the slot. From there, I've been a overly regular contributor of points of information and floor speeches. I apologise very heartily to all three presidents for annoying them with the incessant floor speeches I was trying to give. But I've enjoyed every debate, and in terms of what I've done within the union, I've mainly been on, so I have I organise the presidential debate, which is coming up. Please come to it if anyone is. It's great. It's on the Commonwealth, so I'm looking forward to that. But I'm working with the debate subcom, and also actually there are so many just wonderful people within the union, utterly wonderful, amazing people. Like the vast majority of people, it has a reputation for being this like place of, terrible intrigue, and the vast majority of people are lovely. Absolute vast majority. And a lot of my friendships have been forged through there, been forged through the political world. Really good friendships that can last. On the basis not of like faction intrigue, but people who are really passionate interested about politics. And it's that kind of like strength I want to draw out, if that makes sense. But yeah, I've had a fun time, regardless of whether I win or lose. It's been great.
Again, this might sound a bit repetitive because you touched on, but I do want to give you the same set of questions for the union section. But tell me more about like the highlights that you have had in the union.
I'm trying to think of some new ones. Would it be terrible if I said the coffee at the Orator? No, that's a joking one. So yes, the highlights. For me, it would be tempting to say just like the speeches I've given, but actually the highlights have been just getting to know so many lovely, brilliant, engaging people. That is probably the highlight. There are so many, I won't embarrass them by naming them, but there are just so many amazing people with amazingly deep political interests, deep historical interests, people with amazing backstories. I think the union works at its best when it can really drive out that talent. So just as one debate, the Arab Spring debate in particular was a highlight for me because we had people who had grown up under Gaddafi and talking about that very movingly, and grown up under Assad's Syria. That for me was a particular highlight. And I think the union works best when it really, drops the tendency towards factional vicissitude and brings out those voices. And that was definitely has been a highlight for me. But it's forged some really enduring and great friendships. Like I can't thank it enough for that. It's been fantastic as a social space for me, especially given I'm not the most typical person socially. I don't drink. I'm not what you describe as one of the lads, quote unquote, as I think you've probably got the sense of. So it's been fantastic for that reason.
We both know and have you have touched on also how the union can, rightly or wrongly, have some reputational issues and difficulties, and either like cliquiness, taking things too seriously, betrayals, etc., etc., etc. What are some of the lowlights that you have had in the union, or just difficult moments, or just points of struggle, or just disappointments and frustrations?
So I had what I think was probably the good sense to stay mainly out of factional politics early on. So I know a lot of people who were very stressed. I mean, you probably remember the first presidential campaign this year. Michelin's one. Very close. 52-48, The inauspicious margin that was also the case for Brexit. But, extremely close, extremely factional. A lot of, freshers who actually dropped out of the union because they were so intimidated by it. That was not a highlight for me. I luckily stayed out of that. I decided, you know what, it's not worth it. Because, as much as I didn't know the candidates well enough to make a determination for that kind of basis, especially not one to sacrifice the stress to. I think overall, most people in the union, in fact, almost all of them, are extraordinarily decent, clever and kind people. And it's worth remembering that. Most of them are nowhere near as schemy, either as sometimes in their wildest apprehensions they want to believe, or in reality. The degree of scheming is much exaggerated, but there is a perception, I think, which is quite off-putting to freshers, and I certainly felt very put off at the end of last term by just the degree of toxicity that was coming out of close races. And I do think that needs to change. And I think usually it's never usually the fault of an individual at all. But what is needed is people who can communicate. I'm non-factional. I don't, and people who can, for lack of a better word, touch grass, can understand that this is a peripheral part of Cambridge life. It is a part of Cambridge life, but it should, in any life, just be a part of it, not the totality.
When this recording gets released, it will be a Miss campaign week. So,
oh God, yes.
So I think it would be obviously it would be 6 interesting days, and anything could happen. But for now, at the start of this campaign, to the extent that you're comfortable sharing, could you reveal maybe some of your strategies, approaches, or mindsets to this campaign week?
Yeah, of course. First of all, to Josh and Highway, if they're listening to this, it will not be one that's driven by any sort of personal animosity to either of them. They're both great people. Me and Highway shared the same papers. Thanks to we mutually shared revision notes, you'll be pleased to know. So no hint of, I have no interest in any form of negativity towards either of them. I think they're both great people. I think they both make great debates officers. In terms of what I'm going to stress what I'm trying to communicate, which is I want to put passion for intellectual discussion at the very heart of the office and deprioritise factional politics. That's what I want to do. I want to make it clear that the debates officer is there for debates. It's not there for social aggrandisement. It's not there to be part of some kind of haphazard scheming network. It's there primarily to facilitate good, bold motions. A few things I want to do. I want to, first of all, reform access. So I was a big fan of Nick Davis's idea that there should be at least 1 or 2 members' debates. So I think what we're going to have I want a democratic members' debate chosen on by the members. I want a suggestion box for motions as well. But I also want to open access. So I want to open the access to the general public during open week to audition. But I also want to try and generate a degree of cultural change that makes people more comfortable coming forward. There are also a bunch of minor logistical things which would have a big impact, I think, on the course of debates. This sounds terribly minor, but would, I think, have a great impact, which is making sure that in every email that goes out to speakers, there's a basic definition of the motion written, because you occasionally can get some sort of nightmare debates where you've got speakers who've prepared motions and they've got completely different ideas of what it means, and then they stand up and go, I don't know what to say anymore. But my primary hope would be that I run a campaign in such a way that stresses that what I want to do is restore and prioritise debates, the welfare of members, over factional vicissitudes. And that's what I'm going to primarily go for. That I'm somebody who can genuinely say I'm motivated by passion for debating and would be, I think, in a good position, given my experience, to really provide good opportunities for members to break through some of the factional morass and get involved in that world. And this is particularly something I feel passionate about because of the competitive world, right? The competitive world at the moment is amazingly strong within Cambridge, but can't really get involved within the other side of the debates world, and I find that odd, and I'd be hoping to restore that relationship as well.
In the context of giving you a legacy-worthy interview, a piece of recording that you can look back on 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years' time, captures the current snapshot of who you are. I'm sure we'll both listen back and just go, wow, what the hell have we been talking about? So I know we've touched on so many different things, either concretely or ideologically or practically. Is there anything else that you want to add before I wrap it up?
I really can't think so. Although it's bold of you to assume that I would listen back to I hate the sound of my own voice. I'm sure everyone else does as well. You have to get, maybe I'll be over that in 30 years. There's nothing much else to say other than... no, I can't think of much else.
Okay, I've got some final questions then. Before then, I just got a round of rapid fire questions. I don't know what I'm going to ask you, but just instant gut response.
Here we go.
Is Doxbridge real?
Is what?
Doxbridge, Durham, Oxfordshire, Doxbridge.
Yes.
Okay. So it's the D first.
Well, you're going to prejudice me on account of my mother. You know, I'm duty bound. You've torn me between two poles, between the loyalty to Cambridge, three poles, my Oxford residence, and my mother. I'm going to, like Keir Starmer, tactfully decline to express an opinion and abstain.
That's a good start for rapid fire questions. Who is your favourite UK Prime Minister?
Wilson.
Favourite colour?
Prussian blue.
What word do you hate hearing?
Solidarity.
What word do you have a hard time pronouncing?
You're going to have to make me pronounce it. Hegemoniacal. There we go, did it.
Name an onomatopoeia.
Kaboom.
Describe your style in one word.
Chaos. I'm not the best, I'm not a fashion maestro. If you're looking for a debates officer who's on point fashion-wise, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I get my friends are always horrified by the state of my fashion. Hopefully, with some encouragement from my friends, it will improve.
What's one of your nicknames?
Technically, Sammy counts because it's a shortening, but I don't have any others.
Most touching song?
Because of my late grandma, who I miss very much, American Pie.
Is your bed made at the moment?
Tactfully, no comment. You can infer your own conclusions.
Cats or dogs? Not and, but or. I know you mentioned both, but if you had to pick one.
This is tougher than any choice facing any Prime Minister ever. Oh my God, probably dogs. Don't tell my cat I said that.
Are you more cautious or bold?
Really hard. Bold.
Salty or sweet?
Sweet.
Morning or evening?
Don't have to think about that. Evening. Hate mornings.
Love or friendship?
Oh, God. Probably friendship.
Second to last question. You have been through so much. I know that you have this awareness for contextualizing the common struggles that people have, and therefore you understand the struggles that you've gone through are perhaps not the worst, but nevertheless they are major transitions in your life, and I sense this gratitude that you have for your family, for the background, and for the service that, you know, for example, mum committed, or dad's resilience with learning, or your sister's influence on you. It's very heartwarming, I think, to always hear gratitude and to hear the friendships that you've made to help you overcome certain situations. So I think second to last, I want to give you a chance, because this is a legacy-worthy interview, just to properly maybe acknowledge the people who have made a big impact on your life, and what you say will be up to you, but I think it will be a nice gesture for them to hear some appreciation.
There's going to be too many people. I mean, obviously, as you mentioned, I'm very grateful to my entire family. There are a few people in my life, so my mum, my dad, obviously, and they helped me get through what was, a really difficult time when I was suffering with depression. And, I'm always grateful for that, and also their kindness. I know a lot of people. I don't want to. I think they're great as parents, and I want to thank them for that. And obviously my sister, who's an amazing intellectual force of nature, is a lovely sister, and she'll go on to amazing things. There was someone who raised me as a child who sadly died last Christmas. Her name was Julie Warmington, so she was a childminder for the entire village. She was someone who devoted her life to children. She fostered, I think, what was a record number. I think it was 30. She was the longest serving childminder in the entire county ever recorded. She unfortunately died at quite a young age this Christmas of lung cancer, leaving behind 2 children and I think 3 grandchildren. I want to sort of thank her. She's somebody who, I met some of my friends through, so she had a lot of Woodstock in her care. She was amazing. She was, I think, probably the most amazing woman I've ever known. Dedicated, I think, to what she saw as the Christian idea of charity, but also what we can see as a human idea of love and friendship, and the people. And she has changed, or did change through her life, an immeasurable number of people from broken homes, of people who she adopted, and these kind of people don't get thanked enough. Utterly amazing. She had a profound impact on me, and I wanted to put that out there for posterity. I also wanted to. My late grandma was also somebody who's amazing influence on me. She was a woman who came from quite extreme deprivation. She was the first cohort of the Open University, dedicated her life to education, to improving herself, and to the history of art. And she had a profound impact on all of our family, and we know we all miss her very much. Also, just on a slightly lighter note, all of my friends, so I don't know if doing shout-outs would be a good idea, because I think it might fleet people out, but, Gabriel, who sent the form in, we knew quite a lot, as you could probably tell. Oscar, Oliver, so many other people. I don't want to, Charlie, I don't want to name them all. But, people who are just measurable in terms of what we've enjoyed together, sort of late night Jack Gelatos we've enjoyed together, moments we've shared together, and I tell them quite a lot what it means to me, outside of, that to me is more important than anything union related, is those friendships you build, and the people you probably leave for posterity. I also want to thank my boyfriend who's not at Cambridge, Matthew, for putting up with all the union hackery. I may have even dragged him to CUUNA, which I feel very bad. But you did want to get... In my defence, I said, you really do not have to go. You wanted to see the dark heart of the Cambridge... Well, they're actually lovely, Cambridge Conservatives, I'm joking. But, but yes, he's probably put up with quite a lot, and he's been a great source of comfort. But yeah, those are the people I wanted to call out in particular. But yes, obviously there are way too many. Every life is touched by almost near infinite webs of kindness and support. Humans can't live as islands, and we, I think, as a society, would do a lot better by learning a little bit more gratitude. And it's important to stop, as you say, to thank those people.
That's beautiful. That's really, really beautiful, and I'm very touched. And I guess final question is the typical one. I know you've listened to quite a few episodes, so you know what's coming, but I guess just for the context of thinking and tying all the themes of your lives together, starting from, rural Oxford, growing up in the academic household and seeing mum and dad debate and serve, and having the mixed kind of religious kind of nature, even though perhaps it's more of a humanist upbringing, as you mentioned, and then growing up being a proud nerd, taking the time to read as a kid, and I guess as you grow up a little more, questioning or learning more about different sexualities and the histories of LGBT and the progressions that have come about, and just understanding that ultimately perhaps that it all comes down to a personal decision, and for you as your intellectual progress, that corresponds with all the major happenings, all the breakdowns of British politics with Brexit, David Cameron resigning, and then leading up, I guess, to COVID, for example, where you went through those difficult periods with loneliness, anxiety, depression. I just think you've obviously gone through so much and coming to Cambridge, joining the union, debating, trying to find your place, building those friendships, doing the floor speeches, going viral, getting 800,000, not 80,000 views, which I think is extraordinary, to now putting yourself forward as a candidate for debates officer at the Cambridge Union, which is a big move. And as a self-described introvert, as a self-described person who isn't one of the lads.
Yeah, no.
So for you, when you think about all of that, to be sitting here with me to grab this coffee, what's one message, quote, or saying that you wish every teacher, parent, community leader, Vice-Chancellor of university would promote and every child would internalise your life philosophy?
At some level, I think it's too reductive to have one. I think the world is chaotic and complex. I think ultimately what is important to myself is to fight every day to be yourself and to stand up for what you believe in. That's ultimately the core of what I believe. To do so, both of my parents in particular taught me that it's important every day that no matter what the crowd does, no matter what the huge weight of social expectation can often be, the most important thing in life is to fight to be yourself and to fight for what you believe. And it's possible. I was advocating political pragmatism, moderation, but I think those two things don't necessarily run in context. Because at my core, I'm somebody who will, and I think it's the best thing possible is to fight to be yourself.
Truly, Boris Johnson's secret love child.
No, don't you dare.
No, I'm joking. But jokes aside, Sammy, it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate you during exam term to do this, and for being so honest and vulnerable. And I think I appreciate your just genuine nature and articulating your views in with such conviction. And I think I've learned a lot and will be reflecting on some of your ideologies and viewpoints. And I hope that we can maybe chat more off the record as well.
Yes, sure, of course. But thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm aware you're in the middle of finals. Best of luck. It sounds like you're doing well, but I understand yes, my cousin is currently doing finals, so I understand the pressure very well. But thank you I really enjoyed that. Yes, it's always a bit odd talking about yourself, but it was really nice, and thank you.
Thank you, Sammy, and best of luck this week.
Yes, thank you.